They say that politics is the art of the possible, an adage Dina Matos took to heart from a young age.
I thought, very early on that if you become an activist, if you become involved, that you can affect change.
In the fall of 1995, 29-year-old Dina was trying to follow through on her dreams, working in PR for a local hospital and making herself known in political circles. So when she met Jim McGreevey, the handsome and newly single mayor of Woodbridge, New Jersey, no one was surprised that a mutual interest sparked.
I thought he was very charismatic, certainly energetic, and had this way about him that attracted people to him.
They were ambitious, both of them, smart, both of them. They got along very well.
Definitely think that immediately there was some sort of chemistry between us.
Dina quickly found herself entranced by the dashing politician.
He was talking about the hospital where I worked. He offered, assistance if I ever needed anything. I felt as if I had known him forever.
But there was reason to proceed with caution. Jim's personal life was in turmoil.
Shortly after I met Jim, I had heard that his wife had left him abruptly. They had a small child, and she just took off and went back to her native British Columbia. I felt really bad for him.
Over the next year, Dina continued to see Jim at political functions around town. Then, one day, an aide from his office called to schedule a one-on-one dinner.
The 4 or 5 hours we spent together seemed like 2 hours. We were very comfortable with each other. And so I guess that was our first date.
Before long, Jim and Dina were dating exclusively. But the romance was far from typical. By 1997, Jim had decided to run for governor of New Jersey.
It was like I was on the campaign trail from day one. So our dates consisted of picnics and rallies and, dinners, sometimes 2 and 3 dinners in one night.
She said to me, he's like Abraham Lincoln. He's everything I've ever imagined.
As Election Day approached, it actually looked like Jim could pull off an upset. But in the end, he lost by less than 1% of the vote. After campaigning tirelessly by Jim's side, Dina was devastated. But she dusted herself off and stood by her man, who was already planning his next run for the governor's mansion.
Dina and Jim were a good team. They really were. When you saw the president or someone like that take over a room, that's what they did. They complemented each other pretty well that way.
Jim seemed to think so too. And in January of 2000, he slipped an engagement ring on Dina's finger. 8 months later, the couple tied the knot in a Washington, D.C. wedding.
It was at the Hay Adams, and it has a rooftop terrace that overlooks the White House.
Dina was glowing. Talk about a glowing bride, she was glowing. I don't think I've ever seen Dina that happy.
Everyone that we wanted there was there, and it was just my dream wedding.
Just 6 months later, Dina learned she was pregnant. It seemed the young couple was on the fast track to having it all. But Dina could never have guessed how drastically the tides would turn in just 4 short years. On August 9th, 2004, Dina was running errands after work when she got a call from her husband.
Jim asked what time I was going to be home. And this was uncharacteristic for him because it was early in the day and he was always out late. I felt a knot in my stomach. I'm like, something's not right here.
Dina immediately raced home, and when she arrived, she was certain things were horribly wrong.
So Jim and I both sat on the couch in the living room, and he said, this is very difficult for me. I want to let you know that I'm being blackmailed.
In the fall of 2001, 3 years before the conversation that would change her life, Dina Matos was on top of the world. All signs suggested that her husband, Jim McGreevey, would be New Jersey's next governor.
He was running for governor, and she was at his side, and you would see her on the news on TV. Not Dina, my sister, but Dina, the proposed First Lady of New Jersey.
It was the happiest time of my life.
But on November 3rd, the day of Jim's last big rally before the election, Dina realized something was wrong. Only 7 months pregnant, she'd started bleeding. So instead of going to the rally, she rushed to the hospital.
As soon as I got there, they started hooking me up to everything, put me in a hospital bed, put me in a gown, and I'm thinking, okay, this is not a good thing.
Dina was in premature labor, so Jim immediately suspended his campaign and rushed to her side.
The hospital became, campaign headquarters for a while.
The doctors insisted she remain on bed rest. Meanwhile, on November 7th, Jim McGreevey won the election by a landslide. Dina watched the coverage from her hospital bed.
More than anyone, she sacrificed and worked hard. More than anyone. Dina, I love you.
It was a wow moment. I was like, oh my God, my sister's the first lady. Do I still treat her like Dina? Oh, get out of my way? Or is it Dina, the first lady? How are you?
On December 7th, Dina and Jim welcomed their daughter into the world. New Jersey's new first family was off to a great start.
I thought, we're going to, change the state, and we're going to do everything that we promised people we would do.
For Jim, the first order of business was to staff up his new administration, and he seemed to have some interesting prospects. One in particular was a young Israeli man who had worked on Jim's campaign. His name was Golan Sapel. In January 2002, Jim McGreevey named Sapel his national security advisor, a move that raised some eyebrows.
While Golan Sapel had lots of public relations experience, it wasn't really clear what his experience was in Homeland Security. One of the things that people had concerns about is the fact that he wasn't an American. And so therefore, it would be difficult for him to get the proper security clearances, and people wondered, why would you make a political appointment to such an important post right after 9/11?
Back in the governor's mansion, Dina wasn't dwelling on her husband's staffing choices. There were other things occupying her mind, things that seemed threatening to her marriage. By 2002, Dina noticed that Jim had a troubling, secretive side, especially when it came to his ex-wife and their young daughter.
I always wanted to have a relationship with Jim's daughter. I often asked him to have her come and spend holidays with us, and he always said no, because her mother would have to come, it would complicate things.
Even more upsetting, when Jim's ex-wife called, Dina noticed he would take the call as far away from her as possible.
We rarely argued, but when we did argue, it was about something with his ex-wife. I had suspicions that there was possibly something going on.
At the same time, Jim seemed to be going to great lengths to keep Dina from seeing his schedule.
I think Jim was definitely hiding the schedule from me, so I didn't know where he was or where he was supposed to be.
Dina couldn't help but wonder if Jim and his ex had secretly rekindled their romance. And just 2 months later, it seemed her suspicions were spot on.
One day out of the blue, Jim says to me, well, my ex-wife and daughter are coming next week for a visit. And I was just shocked. All of a sudden, he had made the decision without telling me.
The news was stunning enough, but the visit was even worse.
Jim's behavior was very odd and bizarre. He had planned the entire trip without my knowledge. She was also wearing her wedding ring, which I thought was very bizarre.
Dina thought maybe he was regretting breaking up with his first wife. That he thought, oh, if I had just handled things differently with my first wife, perhaps I'd still be in that relationship.
Dina couldn't help but think the man she loved was hiding something.
Obviously, there's something going on.
But never in a million years could she have guessed what his secret really was.
I was just completely incredulous. I couldn't believe it.
I was just in a complete state of shock.
By the summer of 2004, 2 years into her husband's governorship, Dina Matos McGreevy had hit her stride as New Jersey's First Lady.
I really enjoyed having the ability to get involved in causes that were important to me.
But being married to the governor was no cakewalk. So one evening that July, when Jim asked Dina what she would think if he didn't run for a second term, she couldn't help but feel relieved.
Jim said it was because it was not what he had expected. People were fighting, and there were also a number of scandals involving some of his staffers. I didn't want him to give up, but on the other hand, I thought, this is our opportunity to finally have our own life out of the public eye.
But Dina didn't know there was much more to the story. The evening of August 9th, Dina was running errands after work when Jim called and asked her to come home right away.
When I arrived at home, he was already home, which was early for him. I thought, okay, he's going to finally admit that there's something going on with his ex-wife.
But Dina was about to find out her husband was struggling with something else entirely.
He proceeded to tell me that he was being blackmailed, and I asked by whom, and he said by Golan Sippo. And he wants $50 million.
Jim claimed Golan Sipel was threatening him with a sexual harassment lawsuit. The $50 million would buy Sipel's silence.
And I asked why, and he said, well, we had a relationship. It was sexual, but not sexual. And I just started crying. That was a complete shock. If I suspected anything, it was that he was having an affair with his ex-wife, not anyone else, and certainly not another man.
Dina was devastated, but rather than console his wife, Jim got right down to business.
Immediately, his conversation turned to, how am I going to resolve this? This guy wants $50 million. Where am I going to get the money from? Jim was oblivious to my feelings.
The next morning, Dina tried to make sense of her marriage and her life.
I still wasn't questioning whether he was gay or not. The first question was, what's going to happen to us? You know, what's our daughter's life going to be like after this?
Dina knew Jim didn't have the answers, so she called her family and shared the news.
Hey! I was shocked. My heart went out to her. And she was just a mess. And I just tried to comfort her, but how do you comfort somebody in that situation? What do you tell them? What do you tell them?
By August 11th, 2 days after his confession to Dina, Jim and his advisors had decided the best plan of attack was to hold a press conference.
He thought by going public with this, he could take away any threat of blackmail and potentially any lawsuit. That's the reason that the governor gave.
The night before the press conference, Jim and Dina sat at the kitchen table and had one final, eye-opening conversation.
He said he was confused about who he was, about his sexuality, and that he thought he might be gay.
But for Dina, this wasn't about whether her husband was gay. This was about betrayal.
So I asked him why he married me. And he said that he loved me and he wanted us to build a life together. And that was, you know, another blow. How can he be telling me that he loved me when, you know, he had done all these other things? Did he love me ever? And why did he marry me?
It seemed like things couldn't possibly get any worse.
It felt like this was not the man that I married. This was an imposter.
But there was more to Jim's story. And the next morning, Dina would get the shock of her life.
I flipped the TV on. It was scary how she looked.
It felt like an out-of-body experience for me.
My resignation will be effective on November 15th of this year.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On August 12, 2004, Dina Matos was reeling. Her husband, New Jersey Governor Jim McGreevy, was about to give a press conference admitting to an affair with a male staffer.
Here I am thinking that the press conference is going to be about him not seeking another term, and that was it.
But Dina was about to get another unwelcome surprise.
He had been in meetings with his advisors all day on the first floor of the governor's mansion. And he came up with one of his advisors and handed me a copy of his speech. And I started reading it, and I read the phrase, "I am a gay American." And I just couldn't believe what I was reading, because he had not admitted to being gay. I thought, how did he resolve that issue overnight? He was confused, and now all of a sudden, he knows that he's a gay American.
There were points in my life when I began to question what an acceptable reality really meant for me.
That afternoon, the world watched in shock as Jim McGreevey delivered his speech, his blindsided wife by his side.
And so my truth is that I am a gay American. My resignation will be effective on November 15th of this year.
I flipped the TV on and I took one look at Dina. I did not recognize her. It was scary how she looked.
He's at the podium speaking, and I'm standing next to him with some sort of smile plastered on my face. And it felt like an out-of-body experience for me.
I engaged in an adult consensual affair with another man, which violates my bonds of matrimony. It was wrong, it was foolish, it was inexcusable.
It was just heartbreaking, and I thought she was so brave to be standing there with him, and half of me thought she was so stupid to be standing there with him. Dina said to me later when we talked about it, she was sort of determined to take the high road because she didn't want her daughter to look back one day and say, "You weren't there for Dad in his hour of need."
And for this, I ask the forgiveness and the grace of my wife.
I think it's fair to say that people were very concerned for her. Would the marriage last? Would they had a child? How would this all play out?
I know now he had married me for political gain, and that was just devastating.
In November 2004, Dina and her daughter left the governor's mansion and moved into their own home in the New Jersey suburbs. More than 2 years later, Dina and Jim began divorce proceedings.
The fact that all this was going on in the public eye was extremely hard. Because when things happen to families and it's quiet, you deal with it differently. When it's in the public eye and people are questioning you, and people are not just questioning, they're making assumptions and they're talking about you, that's the hard part.
In August 2008, the couple's divorce was finalized. As for Golan Sapel, he returned to his native Israel without filing a lawsuit. The claims of blackmail have never been substantiated. Today, Dina lives in a small New Jersey town with her young daughter, and she works for a healthcare nonprofit.
I still have my difficult days, and it hasn't been an easy road. But I know that I can stand on my own and confront whatever comes my way.
Dina also wrote a bestseller about her marriage to Jim McGreevey.
I think that by telling my story, that I can give other people courage to move on.
Dina is back, and she's self-assured. If anything, I think maybe she's a little more worried about jumping back into the dating life because she thought Jim McGreevey was the one.
These days, Dina has very little interaction with Jim, who left politics behind to become an Episcopal priest. Still, despite everything, she hasn't given up on the prospect of a new marriage.
Marriage is very important. I think it could be very positive, and it could be very rewarding. And who knows, maybe I'll experience it sometime.
When When you're a single mom, struggling to do it all, love often takes a back seat. Gail Couvreau can vouch for that.
I was in my 30s, and I'd already been through one marriage. I was working for a delivery company and had just purchased a daycare center that was quite large, and trying to juggle that and the house and the yard and the kids was really busy.
She was in and out of a few relationships, nothing very serious. She didn't really have too much time for dating.
But one summer day in 1996, while working her delivery job, a chance encounter would turn Gail's love life around.
I walked in one of my deliveries and I thought, wow, look at him. Dark hair, dark eyes, gorgeous.
32-year-old Scott Mawton was a divorced father of 2 young girls. By day, a humble graphic designer. By night, the sexy lead guitarist in a popular Seattle area band.
I wonder because, musicians, they're wild, they're crazy, they're on drugs, they're partying every night. But he was different.
In a music scene dominated by grunge and heroin, Scott was a rare straight arrow.
He didn't drink, he didn't do drugs. He was raising one of his daughters, smart, good-looking. He was just all around perfect.
Gail piqued Scott's interest, too. A few months later, Scott asked her out, and Gail was thrilled.
It was probably the best date that I had ever had with a man. We spent the entire evening just talking about our children and lots of laughter.
When my mom first met Scott, I was around the age of 11. I could tell that she had kind of fallen head over heels for him.
We started seeing each other pretty quickly. It really turned into a very solid relationship.
At last, Gail thought she had finally found her perfect match. But a few months later, she observed something odd when she and Scott were on vacation in Hawaii.
We were driving along and we were going to go to dinner. And suddenly I looked over at Scott and he's like slumping over the steering wheel and just making weird faces. And I said, "Are you okay?" And he goes, "No, I'm not. I need to get some food or something. I'm hyperglycemic."
Gail quickly drove to the nearest restaurant where Scott stumbled into the restroom.
He looked really bad. So I asked, "Please, can you just bring us some bread immediately?"
But oddly, by the time Scott came out of the restroom a few minutes later, he was completely recovered.
He comes out, informs me, everything's fine. I thought, well, how in the world could that be? But I let it go. I didn't know what to think.
Gail and Scott carried on with their day. And later that night, Scott had a surprise in store for Gail. He popped the question.
I was so excited. I didn't even have to think about it twice.
Almost a year after they started dating, Gail and Scott made it official in a small church wedding back home near Bothell, Washington.
My mom was a little nervous at the beginning, just like any bride would be. It was a good thing to see her coming down the aisle.
The day of my wedding was one of the happiest days of my life. It was a beautiful day, all the friends and family there, and the kids just loved him so much. I thought this was for life.
It was a promising start for the Mawton family. Until Halloween night, just 2 months into their marriage.
I was invited to go to a dinner with my family, and Scott had a show that night. And I got home and went to bed expecting him to be home late because they have to break down their equipment.
But hours after the show ended, around 4 a.m., Scott still hadn't returned.
I was very worried. I didn't know what could have possibly happened to him. I hadn't had a phone call. So I called cell phone with no answer.
24 hours later, still with no word from Scott, Gail was frantic and fearing the worst.
She was calling all of their friends and checking hospitals. She called State Patrol, everybody she could think of to try to find him.
Was Scott in trouble? Was it hypoglycemia? Or was something far more sinister going on?
I was panicked. It was just like he vanished.
On October 31st, 1997, just 2 months into their marriage, Gail Couvreau's husband Scott went to his concert and never came home. Suddenly, after more than 24 hours without word, Scott called.
He said he was okay. He was acting like he was remorseful, but he really didn't have a good answer.
Sheepishly, Scott explained that he'd gone out with friends after the gig and had stayed out so late that he was afraid to come home.
He decided he would just spend the night with these people. It didn't make any sense to me. So I was angry.
But in an effort to keep the peace, Gail told Scott to hurry home.
I had just been married 2 months, and I really, really wanted it to work. So I forgave him. You made a mistake. You know how it made me feel. Please don't do it to me again.
Gail put the incident behind her, and life for the couple was soon back on track. By the spring of 1998, Gail sold her daycare business for a $300,000 profit, and the family moved into a gorgeous new home.
They'd have parties and invite all of us over. They were coming into their own.
Meanwhile, Gail continued to work part-time, while Scott quit his computer job to focus on his music.
Scott was doing great with his music career. There was one album that had come out. He was nominated one of the best guitar players in Seattle.
It was an exciting time for the family. But 1 year into their marriage, their good life began to crumble.
It was almost like a gray cloud kind of came over the family. Like something just wasn't right.
By the fall of 1998, the family began to think that Scott was acting strange.
We were arguing more. He was away from the house a lot more, just really starting to distance himself from us.
Seemed like he was sick a lot more often than anyone else in the family, like a mild cold at all times.
Even worse, Gail felt Scott was overlooking the kids.
Suddenly he said he didn't have enough time to take them to their sports or to go show up for their games. He was too busy with the music and the record coming out.
It seemed like he was trying to find reasons or excuses not to be there at night.
And as Scott's behavior continued to decline, according to Gail, so did their bank account.
Gail estimated that their checking account was depleting by about $200 a day. And when she asked Scott to explain himself, he either got angry or he had some explanation, a camera, a guitar repair. He always had a reason for what was going on.
By the winter of 1999, the relationship was in serious trouble, and Gail feared the worst.
I'm not thinking drinking. He's not hungover. Drugs. He doesn't do drugs. So maybe, could it be another woman?
But before she confronted Scott, Gail decided to do some investigating of her own.
One night, I could hear him down in the den. I heard some shaking, and I thought, that kind of sounds weird. I wonder what that is. It sounds like pills shaking. So I pretended like I was asleep, and I waited till he came up to bed, and then I just lied there for a while, and then I snuck downstairs.
Inside Scott's guitar case, Gail saw something that stopped her in her tracks.
I found a couple bottles of pills with his name on them. I didn't know what it was. Had never recognized the name of the drug.
The next morning, Gail called Scott and demanded an answer. His response blew her away.
I flat out asked him, "Are you a heroin addict?" And he admitted that yes, he was.
According to Gail, Scott told her he took the pills to fight withdrawal symptoms.
I just cried. I was very upset. Heroin is horrible. It's a horrible drug.
According to Gail, Scott agreed to check into rehab, but soon he was home.
I was actually sitting in the backyard reading a magazine. It was a beautiful sunny day. And I looked up and there was Scott. And I thought, well, what in the world? Why are you here? And he said, well, I got kicked out of the rehab. He said it had something to do with the insurance.
And Scott was adamant that further rehab would have to wait. He had just received a lucrative job offer, playing backup on a solo album for the lead singer of a popular heavy metal band.
He assured me that when it was all over, then he would get himself help.
But according to Gail, before long the couple's bank account was dwindling once again. And suddenly Scott stopped coming home. Gail had a hunch that Scott was digging himself deeper into addiction.
He wasn't around at all. He wouldn't even tell me where he was living. I just was falling apart. I didn't believe that he was off the drugs. Things were getting out of control. I didn't know what to do.
With the couple essentially separated, Gail had no choice but to take Scott's name off their bank account. But that didn't stop him.
He would just go into the bank and with one of my checks that he had stolen and just say, "Oh no, we're back together again, everything's fine."
He was literally flushing our money down the drain. And so it was very distressing and a terrible time in our lives.
By the spring of 2001, Gail's funds were down to almost nothing. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get much worse, they did.
I just lied awake all night long wondering when these people were going to come after us.
Gail was petrified. She lived in constant fear.
In the spring of 2001, Gail Couvreau hadn't heard from her husband in over 2 months when she received a most disturbing call.
I got a call from one of Scott's friends, one of his new friends that he was hanging out with. He said, "There's things about Scott that I think you need to know."
The friend warned Gail to seek protection for herself and her children.
I was literally terrified. I was very frightened for myself and my children.
Gail was a nervous wreck. She was shaking, and I was really worried about her.
Gail was determined to protect her children at all costs, so she put their house up for rent and moved.
I didn't feel safe being there anymore, so the best thing I could think of was just, let's get away and see if we can hide from them.
Gail would take different routes home from work, and she was always afraid of where Scott was and what he was planning next.
After almost a year on the run, with no sign of Scott or his friends, Gail's fear slowly subsided.
I thought, okay, this is it. He's finally out of our lives, and we can go on.
So Gail and the children moved back into their home.
I had it leased out for these people. They decided that they didn't want to buy it. So I had to move back into the house to get it prepared to be sold.
I don't know how Gail held it together. It was amazing to me that she actually could get up and get to work and get her job done every day.
But Gail's ordeal wasn't over yet. Within a week, Scott showed up and drove off in one of her cars.
He's already taken everything from me, and then he takes my car. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that he had the gall to do this after everything else that he had done.
Gail was on the lookout for Scott, and then one day she spotted him.
So I'm driving down the road, and there comes my car, pulls right out in front of me. I'm like, oh my God, there it is. So I picked up the phone, I called the police, he pulls into the gas station. Next thing I knew, there's 6 cop cars, 12 guns pointed at Scott, the car. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this is really happening.
Scott was promptly arrested and taken into custody. By now, there were also warrants out on him from another county. By 2003, Gail filed for bankruptcy and divorce.
My life was just shattered, and I was trying to hold everything together.
Gail was done, and by the end of 2003, her divorce from Scott was final. But Scott's run-ins with the law were far from over. In the spring of 2004, Gail turned on the news and saw her ex-husband.
When I looked at the screen, he's in jail, in a little jail outfit.
Scott had been arrested once again for something else entirely.
Scott had a big operation going. I knew he wasn't going to stop.
I just couldn't believe that this was the man that I married.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In April of 2004, Gail watched the news in total shock as her ex-husband Scott Mawton had been arrested again, but not for drugs.
I was shocked because I thought if anything that he was going to be arrested for, it would be drugs. He was running this huge identity theft ring. I had not a clue.
It appeared Scott had been using his computer know-how and an arsenal of high-tech equipment to manufacture fake IDs.
Scott's operation was pretty big. He would have people working for him to get some of the information, sometimes all of it, sometimes not. Whatever he didn't get, he was smart enough to be able to fill in on his own.
They would go to an apartment complex and break into the back of the mailbox panel and just take all the mail. And they did it over and over and over again.
It's my understanding from the police that when they were able to get into his apartment, there was really no living situation whatsoever. A computer, bags and bags and bags of mail.
Among the evidence, authorities found fake passports, driver's licenses, stolen credit cards, and even falsified FBI credentials.
You're stealing from innocent people who had nothing to do with anything and destroying their lives, as if destroying mine and my children's wasn't bad enough.
A few weeks later, Scott went to court, but his case was thrown out due to a problem with the search warrant.
I got the call the next day that there was a technicality and he was set free. I couldn't believe it.
Scott was now a free man. But by the summer of 2007, he would turn up again on the Linwood Police Department's most wanted list.
I received a call from one of our patrol officers. A person had come into our local Lexus dealership and purchased a $71,000 Lexus. The identification had his picture, but the information belonged to the victim of a burglary.
It didn't take police long to identify the photo on the fraudulent license.
I had several responses from nearby agencies that all said it was Scott Mawton. Everybody kind of knew who he was. He'd been committing crimes all over the place, and many agencies were looking for him. I placed Scott on our 10 most wanted list because I knew he wasn't going to stop.
I turned on the TV early in the morning, and there he was on the news, and I couldn't believe it. And I grabbed my phone and called Gail, and I said, "The rock star's at it again."
Scott had fooled everybody into believing he was this rich, famous, successful rock star. He needed the car to drive to fulfill that. He needed to be able to really use the car, though, to go and commit his crimes. He could drive up in a beautiful car. People figured he must have money. Made his life a little easier.
On August 31st, 2007, Scott was arrested and later charged with 10 counts of identity theft, forgery, and possession of stolen property. On February 5th, 2008, 12 years after Gail first met Scott Mawton, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
I was glad that Scott was going to jail for a long time once he got sentenced. It feels good knowing that he'll be sitting in prison.
Scott was given the most time that they were legally able to give him. I clapped. I cheered.
Today, Gail lives with her good friend Marka and is slowly picking up the pieces. But she still feels the sting of Scott's betrayal.
Scott took from me hundreds of thousands of dollars. My future that I could have used with this money to invest for myself, my retirement, my children, my home that I worked so hard for. Everything was gone.
All of this has been a very traumatic experience for Gail and her boys. Gail went from a $400,000 home to staying with friends or family.
But despite it all, Gail refuses to be defeated.
He took a lot from us, but there's still life ahead, and I'm still alive and breathing, and so is my mom and my brother, and he can't take everything.
I think that when we go through these things, changes us. I think it makes us a stronger person, even though we hate hearing that. But I think it makes you take a look at what's important and what isn't important.
The night New York forgot her name, the city was still awake. Sirens stitched the avenues together, steam lifted from the grates like breath from a restless giant, and somewhere between the last open deli and the shuttered storefront, a woman vanished without a sound. No scream. No struggle anyone could swear to. Just absence. By morning, the papers would call it a missing person. By the end of the week, they would call it a mystery. By the end of the year, they would call it a cold case. And decades later, the city would still be whispering her name into the dark, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might wake something that never truly went to sleep. It was 1987, a year of excess and edge, when Wall Street roared and the subways rattled with graffiti and grit. The neighborhood where she was last seen sat at the uneasy border between promise and decay, a few blocks where ambition brushed shoulders with fear. Streetlights flickered like tired eyes. A payphone rang and rang until it went silent. In that pocket of the city, time seemed to hesitate, and then move on without her. Friends said she was careful. Coworkers said she was punctual. Family said she always called. That night, the call never came. The first officers on the scene didn't have a scene to secure. No blood, no broken glass, no abandoned purse neatly placed for dramatic effect. Just a stretch of sidewalk, damp from a late drizzle, and a witness who thought they'd seen a man standing too close. Too close is a dangerous phrase in New York. It can mean anything. It can mean nothing. The patrol car's radio crackled, names were written down, times were logged, and the city did what it always does when someone slips through a crack. It kept moving. By sunrise, detectives were leafing through her life like a file that refused to organize itself. Apartment keys sat on the kitchen counter. The bed was made. A jacket hung where she always left it. There were plans penciled into a calendar that now felt like taunts. Lunch on Friday. A movie next week. A dentist appointment she would never make. In the living room, the television hummed with static when no one turned it off. It was the kind of detail that made investigators pause, the kind that made them imagine a return that never happened. The community reacted the way communities always do at first, with urgency dressed as hope. Flyers went up on lampposts and bus shelters, her face reproduced in black and white, smiling, alive, asking strangers to look harder. Volunteers walked routes she might have taken, peering into doorways, calling her name into alleys that swallowed sound. Tips poured in. Some were earnest. Some were cruel. A woman who looked like her on a train. A scream heard at midnight. A car idling too long at the curb. Each lead lit a match in the dark and burned out just as fast. Inside the precinct, the case file grew thick with paper and thin with answers. Detectives traced her last hours minute by minute, reconstructing movements from receipts and half-remembered conversations. She had left work on time. She had stopped at a shop she frequented. She had been seen heading toward home. Then the line went dead. The city map on the wall filled with pins, red and blue marking sightings and suppositions, a constellation that refused to resolve into a picture anyone could understand. There were suspects, of course. There are always suspects. An ex-boyfriend whose temper had been noted before. A coworker who stayed late too often. A neighbor who knew too much about her schedule. Each one was questioned under harsh lights, each one offered alibis that seemed solid until they weren't, and then solid again. Polygraphs were suggested and declined. Lawyers appeared. Doors closed. The case pressed forward and then slowed, like traffic hitting an unseen bottleneck. What unnerved the investigators most were the details that didn't belong. A witness who described a jacket she didn't own. A receipt found blocks away, stamped at a time that didn't fit. A phone call to her apartment from a number that went nowhere, placed hours after she was supposed to be home. The kind of clues that feel important simply because they resist explanation. The kind that linger. Weeks turned into months. The flyers peeled and faded. New faces replaced hers on the lampposts. The tip line rang less often. The city's attention shifted, pulled toward the next shock, the next headline. In the precinct, her file moved from the active shelf to a drawer labeled with a word that felt like a verdict, cold. It wasn't a declaration of defeat, the detectives would say. It was a pause. A waiting. But time has a way of hardening pauses into endings. Still, the case refused to die quietly. Every so often, a call would come in, a whisper from someone who thought they knew something now that years had passed. A confession that unraveled under scrutiny. A dream mistaken for memory. A body found that wasn't hers. Each time, the file would come out, the pages rustling like dry leaves, and for a moment the room would fill with that old electricity, the sense that this time might be different. Each time, it wasn't. The city changed around the mystery. Buildings were torn down and raised again. Bars became boutiques. Streets were scrubbed, then dirted anew. Detectives retired, moved on, took the weight of the case with them into quieter lives. New investigators inherited the file, reading it late at night, trying to hear the voices of those who had first walked that sidewalk in the rain. They circled the same facts, the same gaps, wondering what had been missed when everything was still fresh. There were rumors, always rumors. A serial predator passing through. An argument gone wrong. A shadow economy that swallowed people whole. None of it could be proven. The absence at the center of the case grew heavier with each passing year, a gravity that bent speculation into strange shapes. Families learned to live with unanswered questions, a skill no one teaches and no one ever truly masters. Holidays passed with an empty chair. Birthdays marked time like scars. In the late nights, when the precinct quieted and the city outside hummed at a lower pitch, some detectives would admit what they rarely said out loud, the fear that the answer was simple and therefore invisible. That the truth had been standing in plain sight, disguised as ordinary, slipping past because no one thought to look twice. It's a dangerous thought, the kind that keeps you awake, replaying old interviews, old maps, old photographs, searching for a flicker you might have missed. By the early 90s, the case had become a reference point, a shorthand for frustration. New officers heard about it in hushed tones, a cautionary tale about how quickly a trail can go cold in a city that never stops generating noise. Journalists revisited it on slow news days, dredging up the familiar phrases, mysterious disappearance, baffling clues, communities still haunted. Each article promised renewed attention and delivered the same ending, no arrests, no closure. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of dust and disappointment, the facts remain. Dates. Times. Names. A handful of inconsistencies that refused to align. A city that had watched a woman vanish and had never quite forgiven itself. The file waited, patient in its way, as if it understood something the living did not. That time, for all its cruelty, has a habit of loosening tongues and shifting shadows. Years would pass before anyone could say the case had moved again, before whispers began to circulate that something old had been touched and something buried had stirred. For now, in the echo of 1987, there was only the night, the wet pavement, and a city that kept moving forward while one story remained frozen, suspended between what was known and what would not reveal itself, a cold case settling into legend, waiting for the moment when waiting would no longer be enough. By the time the case crossed its first anniversary, the city had learned how to look past it. New York has a talent for selective blindness, a survival skill honed over decades of noise and tragedy. Another missing face became background static, another unanswered question absorbed into the daily grind. But inside the precinct, the file refused to stay quiet. It sat there, thick and stubborn, daring anyone to prove it wrong, daring someone to explain how a person could evaporate in a place packed with millions of witnesses who never saw enough. The detectives assigned to it began to understand that this wasn't a single moment to be solved, but a pattern to be unraveled. They went back to the beginning, again and again, replaying the last confirmed sighting like a looped tape that warped with every listen. A clerk remembered small talk that suddenly felt loaded with meaning. A doorman recalled a figure pausing under a streetlight, too still, too patient. These weren't revelations. They were fragments, sharp-edged and incomplete, the kind that cut deeper the more you handle them. They canvassed the blocks surrounding her route home, knocking on doors that had been knocked before, asking questions that had already been asked. People answered differently this time. Memory changes when time stretches it. What was once vague became confident. What was once certain grew slippery. One man swore he'd heard footsteps running. A woman insisted she'd seen a car pull away fast, tires whispering against wet asphalt. None of it could be pinned down, but none of it could be dismissed outright either. The city was talking, but it wasn't saying what anyone needed to hear. A break seemed to come from an unexpected place. A bag, discovered during unrelated construction, turned up several blocks away from where she vanished. It was worn, generic, the kind of thing 1,000 people owned. Inside were items that might have belonged to anyone, a receipt, a pen, a folded piece of paper with a number written hastily, as if time had been short. For a moment, the air in the room changed. Gloves snapped. Cameras clicked. The bag was photographed, catalogued, examined inch by inch. It promised answers in the way only found objects can. The promise dissolved quickly. The receipt led nowhere. The pen was unremarkable. The number, traced and retraced, belonged to a disconnected line. The bag itself couldn't be conclusively linked to her. Maybe it was hers. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had been planted by chance, a coincidence cruel enough to feel deliberate. The detectives added it to the file, another question mark in a case already crowded with them. As the investigation stretched on, attention shifted toward the people closest to her, not because of evidence, but because proximity is often mistaken for guilt when nothing else fits. Friends were re-interviewed, their grief now tinged with defensiveness. Family members answered the same questions with voices worn thin by repetition. Did she seem afraid? Was she seeing anyone new? Had she mentioned plans to leave the city? Each answer closed one door and opened another, leading investigators deeper into a maze with no visible center. The ex-boyfriend resurfaced, his name circled in red ink once more. His alibi held, but only just. He'd been alone, watching television, a detail that felt too ordinary to be comforting. He answered questions calmly, perhaps too calmly, and left the room with a look that lingered in the minds of those who watched him go. Suspicion is a strange thing. It doesn't need proof to survive. It only needs doubt. Then there were the anonymous tips, the kind that arrive without warning and leave behind a residue of unease. A voice on the phone claimed to know where she was buried, then hung up. A letter arrived with directions scribbled in uneven handwriting, leading to an empty lot and nothing else. Detectives followed each one, because not following felt worse, because the cost of ignoring a real lead was too high to bear. Every dead end deepened the sense that someone, somewhere, was enjoying the chase. The media circled back, drawn by the persistence of the mystery. Headlines hardened into familiar phrases: baffling, unexplained, cold case refuses to cool. Reporters stood on the same sidewalks, cameras pointed at nothing in particular, narrating absence as if it were an event. Neighbors watched from windows, arms crossed, unsure whether to feel comforted or exploited. The story took on a life of its own, detached from the woman at its center, feeding on speculation and fear. Behind the scenes, technology lagged behind the questions being asked. DNA was still a promise more than a solution. Databases were fragmented, slow, incomplete. Evidence that might one day speak remained silent, locked in boxes labeled with dates that grew older by the year. Detectives did what they could with what they had, aware that the clock was always working against them, erasing memories, blurring faces, turning certainty into rumor. One investigator, nearing retirement, began to obsess over a detail others had dismissed. A timing discrepancy, just minutes off, but stubborn. He laid out the sequence again, mapping it against traffic patterns, subway schedules, the rhythms of the neighborhood at that hour. He believed there was a window, small but significant, where something had happened quickly and decisively. If that window could be defined, maybe the rest would fall into place. He worked late, chasing that belief through stacks of reports, until even he began to doubt it. The community felt the weight of the unresolved case in quieter ways. Parents walked children home longer than necessary. Locks were checked twice. Strangers were measured with sharper eyes. The disappearance became a story told in fragments, a warning passed along without details, its power rooted in the fact that no one knew how it ended. Fear doesn't need specifics. It thrives on gaps. As years accumulated, the case was transferred again, handed to fresh eyes trained in new methods but facing the same old questions. They digitized what they could, creating timelines on glowing screens, hoping patterns would emerge where paper had failed. Names were run through updated systems. Faces were compared against new records. Each search ended the same way, with a quiet hum and no match found. Still, the case resisted being forgotten. It appeared in training materials, in lectures about missed opportunities and investigative perseverance. It was cited as an example of how quickly momentum can evaporate, how easily a crime can slip beyond reach in a city that offers both endless witnesses and endless hiding places. To some, it was a lesson. To others, a challenge. Late one night, a junior detective stumbled across an old interview transcript and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stale air of the records room. A sentence stood out, something said casually years earlier, something no one had followed up on because it hadn't fit the narrative at the time. It mentioned a man, a place, a routine. The detective read it again, slower this time, aware of the dangerous thrill that comes with thinking you found something everyone else missed. He brought it up at the next briefing. The room reacted cautiously. They'd been here before. Hope had burned them more than once. Still, the name was unfamiliar, the place off the usual map. It was enough to warrant a look, if only to put another question to rest. Files were pulled. Old addresses were checked. The process began again, not with confidence, but with a wary kind of curiosity. Outside, the city continued its endless transformation, unaware or indifferent to the stirrings inside a single case file. Streets changed names. Buildings gained new faces. But somewhere beneath the layers of progress and forgetting, the truth remained fixed, waiting for the moment when attention, persistence, and chance might finally align. For now, the case remained unsolved, its edges worn smooth by time, its center still sharp enough to cut. A woman had vanished. A city had looked away. And the silence left behind was growing heavier, pressing down on anyone who dared to believe that answers, no matter how delayed, might still be possible. Time has a way of rearranging priorities inside a police department. Emergencies shout. Old mysteries whisper. The cold case lingered on the edge of hearing, never loud enough to demand attention, never quiet enough to disappear. The junior detective who'd flagged the forgotten interview kept returning to it in stolen moments, rereading the transcript until the words began to feel less like ink and more like a voice trying to break through a wall. It wasn't what was said that mattered most. It was how casually it had been offered, how easily it had slid past without resistance, as if the truth had worn a disguise so ordinary that no one thought to question it. The name mentioned belonged to a man who had lived a life designed to leave no impression. Not a criminal in any official sense. No record worth mentioning. He moved often, worked where work was available, left behind little more than forwarding addresses and the memory of someone who kept to himself. In 1987, he had lived 2 blocks off her route home, close enough to matter, distant enough to be overlooked. The place referenced in the interview was a bar that no longer existed, shuttered, and replaced by something brighter, something that sold the illusion of safety with craft beer and polished wood. Investigators began to reconstruct the geography of a city that no longer existed. Old maps were pulled, their edges soft with age. Photographs showed streets before renovation, before gentrification, before the lights got better and the shadows learned to hide elsewhere. They marked where the bar had been, where the man had lived, where she had last been seen. The proximity was unsettling. Not damning. Just unsettling enough to tighten the room. They tracked down former employees of the bar, a task that felt like chasing smoke. Most had moved on, scattered by time and necessity. A few remembered him vaguely, a quiet regular who sat alone, who watched more than he talked. Someone recalled a habit of leaving at odd times, slipping out between songs, as if following a schedule only he understood. Another mentioned seeing him speak with a woman once, nothing memorable about it except the way he leaned in, intent, focused. None of it amounted to evidence. All of it felt like texture, the background grain of a story that had been flattened by years of retelling. The man himself proved harder to find. Records showed he'd left the city in the late 80s, drifting through a series of towns, never staying long enough to be known. He had worked construction, warehouse jobs, night shifts where anonymity was part of the uniform. Each address led to another, a breadcrumb trail scattered across states, eroded by time. When detectives finally reached him by phone, decades after the disappearance, his voice was calm, unremarkable, tinged with mild annoyance at the intrusion. He remembered her, he said. Barely. A face in a crowd. A passing conversation. He denied seeing her that night, denied knowing anything beyond what the papers had printed years ago. His timeline was neat, his memory selective. He'd been elsewhere. Always elsewhere. There was nothing to contradict him. There rarely is, when time has done its work. Still, the call shifted something. It brought the case back into circulation, stirred interest among detectives who had only known it as a cautionary tale. They began to look for patterns beyond the obvious, for connections that hadn't seemed relevant before. Who else had lived nearby and left suddenly? Who else had frequented the same places and vanished from the city's consciousness? The net widened, and with it came a flood of new names, most of which led nowhere. Evidence, such as it was, remained stubbornly mute. Boxes were opened, their contents laid out under new lights. Fibers that once held promise were now degraded beyond usefulness. Photographs showed angles investigators had studied to exhaustion. The bag found during construction was re-examined with updated methods, but it yielded nothing new, no voice from the past willing to speak. The technology had advanced. The answers had not. What haunted the team most were the near misses, the moments when the case had brushed up against possibility and slid away. A traffic camera installed years later might have caught something if it had existed then. A DNA database built too late to include the unknown sample that no one could even confirm belonged to her. Progress, viewed from the wrong angle, can feel like mockery. The family watched from a distance, wary of hope. They had learned the cost of optimism, how it exacted payment in disappointment and exhaustion. Still, the renewed activity stirred old feelings, reopened questions they had long sealed away. They answered calls, provided interviews, walked through memories that had faded at the edges but remained sharp at the center. Each conversation ended the same way, with thanks, with promises, with silence that followed too quickly. The city, meanwhile, continued to tell its own version of the story. Blogs and late-night radio shows speculated freely, weaving theories from rumor and coincidence. Some claimed she had left willingly, tired of the city, eager for a different life. Others insisted she had been targeted, selected by someone who understood the streets better than she did. The truth, whatever it was, remained stubbornly out of reach, hidden behind layers of narrative that obscured more than they revealed. Inside the department, a quiet divide formed between those who believed the case could still be solved and those who saw it as an exercise in managing expectations. The believers chased details, small and unglamorous, trusting that accumulation would eventually yield clarity. The skeptics focused on documentation, on preserving what was known for whoever might come next. Both approaches were born of experience. Neither offered guarantees. One afternoon, buried deep in an unrelated file, a detective found a reference that caused him to pause. A complaint logged years after the disappearance, dismissed as unfounded at the time. A woman had reported being followed near the same blocks, described a man whose habits felt familiar. The description was generic, the timing off by months, but the location aligned too neatly to ignore. The complaint had been closed, forgotten, filed under the weight of more urgent matters. They tracked her down, unsure what they hoped to hear. She was older now, cautious, reluctant to revisit the memory. When she spoke, her words came slowly, measured, as if she were translating something fragile. She described the feeling of being watched, the way footsteps matched hers for too long. She'd turned suddenly, caught a glimpse of a man who looked away too quickly. Nothing had happened. She had gone home shaken but unharmed. She hadn't thought it mattered. It mattered now, not because it solved anything, but because it suggested a pattern that had never been formally acknowledged. Proximity. Observation. Timing. The idea that the disappearance wasn't a random rupture but the culmination of something quieter, something that unfolded over days or weeks, unseen. It was a theory, nothing more. But theories are the scaffolding on which investigations rebuild themselves. The detectives mapped incidents that shared those traits, looking for overlap. Most connections dissolved under scrutiny. A few remained stubborn, resistant to dismissal. The man from the bar appeared again, not as a suspect in any official sense, but as a recurring presence in the background of a neighborhood story that had never been told all at once. Coincidence can explain many things. It struggles with repetition. They reached out to him again. This time, he declined to speak. His attorney returned the call, polite and firm, citing the passage of time, the lack of evidence, the futility of revisiting settled matters. The refusal was legal. It was also frustrating. Silence can feel accusatory even when it isn't meant to be. As the months passed, momentum slowed once more. Leads thinned. Enthusiasm cooled. The case teetered on the edge of retreating back into the drawer labeled cold. But something had changed. The questions were sharper now, more focused. The sense that the truth was not expansive and unknowable but narrow and concealed had taken hold. In the quiet moments, detectives wondered about the night itself, about how quickly lives can diverge. A different turn, a different choice, a delay of minutes. The city offers infinite paths. Most lead home. Some do not. The disappearance remains suspended between those possibilities, a story incomplete not because it lacked details, but because the right ones had yet to be arranged in the right order. The case did not move forward in leaps. It inched, hesitant and uneven, guided by intuition as much as fact. And beneath it all, the same question persisted, unaltered by time or effort. How does someone vanish in plain sight, and what does it say about a city when the answer takes decades to approach, if it ever comes at all? By the fourth decade since the night she vanished, the case existed in two places at once. On paper, it was dormant, a file with a history longer than its list of conclusions. In the minds of those who kept returning to it, it was restless, shifting shape each time someone dared to look at it from a new angle. The detectives who still cared had learned not to expect breakthroughs. They listened instead for subtle changes in the background noise, the faint indications that something old was beginning to move. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It crept in through bureaucracy, through a routine audit of archived evidence prompted by a departmental push to digitize the past. Boxes were reopened not because anyone believed they would speak, but because policy demanded it. Gloves were worn out of habit. Labels were checked and rechecked. The process was mechanical, almost reverent, as if the act of preservation itself might somehow redeem years of unanswered questions. Among the items pulled from storage was the bag found during construction so long ago, the one that had once raised hope and then quietly disappointed. It had been tested before, catalogued and dismissed. This time, it was examined with methods that didn't exist when it was first logged. The technicians worked patiently, aware of the expectations pressing down on them, aware of how often cold cases ask for miracles and deliver none. What they found was not a revelation, but it was not nothing either. A trace, degraded and incomplete, surfaced where there had once been only silence. It could not be definitively linked to her. It could not point cleanly to a suspect. It was, at best, an echo. But echoes matter in cases like this. They suggest proximity. They imply contact. They whisper that the past has not fully erased itself. The result landed on a detective's desk late in the afternoon, printed on paper that felt heavier than it should have. He read it twice, then again, cautious of the familiar trap of wanting meaning where there might be coincidence. The trace did not match anything in the databases available. That was expected. What mattered was that it existed at all. For the first time in years, the case had something new to say, even if it was speaking softly. The team convened quietly. No announcements. No premature optimism. They discussed what the trace could mean and, just as importantly, what it could not. It did not prove violence. It did not establish a timeline. It did not identify a perpetrator. It did, however, reopen the possibility that the bag was not random, that it had been in contact with someone connected to the disappearance. The distinction was subtle, but it changed the way the file was read. Attention returned, inevitably, to the man whose name kept resurfacing at the edges. The one who had lived nearby, frequented the bar, drifted away without leaving much behind. The trace could not be matched to him directly. There was no legal path to compel cooperation. Still, his profile was revisited, this time with a more disciplined focus. Not as a villain imagined in hindsight, but as a variable that had never been fully resolved. Investigators reconstructed his movements after he left New York, lining them up against other incidents, other disappearances that shared certain traits without sharing proof. Most comparisons failed quickly. A few lingered long enough to unsettle. Patterns suggested themselves and then dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind only questions about how many times coincidence can repeat before it demands explanation. The family was informed carefully, deliberately. They had heard too many promises delivered with too much confidence. This time, the language was restrained. There was new information. It did not change what was known. It did not provide answers. It justified, perhaps, another look. The reaction was measured, a blend of guarded hope and practiced skepticism. They thanked the detectives. They waited. Waiting had become second nature. Outside the department, interest began to stir again, driven less by official statements than by the quiet hum of rumor. Someone noticed activity around an old name. Someone else filed a public records request. A journalist remembered the case and sensed a shift, subtle but real. Articles appeared, cautious in tone but sharp in implication. Cold case revisited. New forensic review. Questions remain. The city leaned in, just slightly. With renewed attention came pressure. Supervisors asked for updates. Timelines were requested. The case, long accustomed to patience, was suddenly expected to justify itself. Detectives resisted the urge to rush. They knew the danger of momentum untempered by evidence. They worked instead on foundations, revisiting interviews with a clarity sharpened by years of context. Statements once dismissed as irrelevant were reread, not for what they said, but for what they assumed. One such assumption stood out. The idea that the disappearance had been sudden, impulsive, unplanned. It was a comforting notion, because it framed the event as an anomaly rather than a failure of observation. But the accumulating details suggested something slower, quieter. The feeling of being watched reported by another woman. The odd habits of the man at the bar. The trace on the bag that implied contact without chaos. Together, they hinted at deliberation. This reframing changed the questions being asked. Instead of why that night had gone wrong, investigators began to ask when it had begun. How long someone might have noticed her routines. How predictable her movements were. How invisible attention can be in a city where no one looks for it. The disappearance stopped feeling like an explosion and started to resemble an erosion, something that happened gradually until one final moment made it irreversible. The man, contacted again through formal channels, remained silent. His attorney's responses grew shorter, less accommodating. Silence, in this context, was not an admission. It was a boundary. But boundaries invite scrutiny, especially when they appear precisely where questions concentrate. Detectives documented everything, careful to distinguish inference from fact, intuition from evidence. The file thickened again, not with answers, but with focus. As the investigation pressed forward, time itself seemed to push back. Witnesses had died. Buildings were gone. Records were incomplete. Each obstacle reinforced the same truth: the case had survived because it was unfinished, but it had also been damaged by the very years that kept it alive. Progress came at the cost of certainty, and certainty had always been in short supply. Yet something about this phase felt different. Not hopeful. Not triumphant. Just aligned. The pieces on the table no longer contradicted each other outright. They suggested a narrow corridor where the truth might reside, difficult to access but no longer invisible. The detectives sensed it in the way discussions changed, in the way assumptions were challenged rather than accepted. The city watched from a distance, half invested, half exhausted by the idea that an old wound might be reopened. For some, the possibility of answers was unsettling. Closure has a way of disturbing the stories people tell themselves to make sense of long silence. For others, it was overdue, a reckoning delayed by years of distraction and disbelief. As the case edged closer to something resembling clarity, it also edged closer to resistance. Not just legal, but cultural. The notion that a person could live an unremarkable life while carrying the weight of an unresolved disappearance unsettled more than just investigators. It challenged the comfort of thinking that monsters are obvious, that danger announces itself. The file remained open. The questions sharpened. And somewhere within the narrowing space between what was known and what was suspected, the case waited, patient and unforgiving, for the next misstep, the next memory, the next fragment of the past willing to surface and refuse to be ignored. By the time the investigation entered what detectives privately called its fifth life, patience had become both weapon and burden. Every step forward was deliberate, every assumption interrogated. The case no longer chased noise, it listened for rhythm. The narrow corridor of possibility identified months earlier began to dictate movement, pulling attention away from the city's endless distractions and back toward a handful of people, places, and habits that refused to loosen their grip. They started with routine, because routine is where predators hide. Her schedule was reconstructed once more, not as a list of events but as a pattern of expectations. When she left work. Which streets she preferred. Where she slowed down, where she cut corners. The city's geography was overlaid with human behavior, a map not of roads but of predictability. It became clear how small the window really was, how few minutes separated safety from silence. That window pointed again toward the blocks surrounding the long-gone bar. Not because of sentiment or repetition, but because of convergence. Foot traffic. Lighting conditions in the late 80s. The flow of people at closing time. Investigators studied photographs taken by zoning offices and transit authorities, images never meant for crime solving but suddenly essential. Shadows fell differently back then. Corners existed that no longer did. A retired detective was brought in, one of the few still alive who had walked that street in 1987. He spoke slowly, careful not to embellish. He remembered the area as liminal, neither safe nor overtly dangerous, the kind of place where attention drifted just enough for things to happen unnoticed. He remembered dismissing a lead early on because it felt too thin, too dependent on instinct. Saying it out loud now, decades later, felt like a confession. The lead he referred to involved a conversation overheard by a bartender, someone who had claimed to hear the man speak about routines, about timing, about knowing when places emptied out. At the time, it sounded like bar talk, the kind of bravado that dissolves in daylight. No report was filed. No follow-up conducted. The bartender had moved on. The words, however, had stayed behind, waiting for a moment when they might be understood differently. Finding the bartender took time. Lives scatter. When they finally reached him, he was reluctant, wary of becoming part of a story that had grown larger than memory. He didn't remember specifics. He remembered tone. He remembered a man who spoke as if the city were a puzzle he enjoyed solving. It wasn't threatening, just unsettling. At the time, he hadn't thought it meant anything. Now, he wasn't so sure. None of it constituted evidence. All of it constituted context. The case was becoming less about a single act and more about a mindset, about the possibility that the disappearance was the endpoint of observation rather than impulse. That distinction mattered. It reframed the man not as someone who reacted, but as someone who waited. Investigators turned their attention to records that tracked movement rather than crime. Employment logs. Temporary work placements. Overnight shifts that aligned with the window identified years earlier. The man's work history revealed long stretches of night labor, positions that allowed him to blend into darkness without drawing attention. He had known when people left places because he had left places himself at those same hours. The trace from the bag was revisited, not for what it identified, but for when contact might have occurred. The degradation suggested age, not recent contamination. It aligned with the original timeline closely enough to matter. Combined with the behavioral analysis, it suggested proximity during the critical period, not before, not after. During. Legal constraints loomed large. Without direct evidence, the man remained untouchable. Investigators documented meticulously, building a structure that might one day support action, even if today it could only stand as theory. They sought corroboration wherever possible, knowing that repetition, not revelation, often breaks stalemates. Then came the smallest shift, the kind that barely registers until it's too late to ignore. A routine database update flagged a name connected to one of the man's former addresses. Not a criminal record. A civil filing. A dispute that placed him in a specific location at a specific time shortly after he left New York. The date mattered. It suggested urgency, movement motivated by something other than opportunity. The address led to a town where another woman had disappeared years earlier. The case was different. The circumstances didn't align cleanly. But the timing did. Investigators tread carefully, aware of the danger of narrative gravity, the pull toward connecting dots that want to be connected. They reviewed the second case with fresh eyes, looking not for sameness, but for echoes. There were echoes. Not enough to accuse. Enough to notice. The pattern, if it existed, was subtle, buried beneath ordinary explanations. The kind of pattern that survives because it never announces itself. The kind that relies on the assumption that ordinary people are safe. The pressure inside the department intensified. Resources were finite. Every hour spent on an old case was an hour not spent on something new. Yet the sense that they were circling something real refused to dissipate. Supervisors allowed the work to continue, not because they believed in an imminent breakthrough, but because the alternative, closing the file again, felt increasingly dishonest. The family sensed the shift without being told. Communication changed tone. Questions became more specific. Names were mentioned that hadn't been mentioned before. They listened, careful not to interrupt, careful not to hope. When asked whether they would support further action if the opportunity arose, their answer was immediate. Yes. Whatever it takes. Waiting had taught them clarity, if nothing else. The city, restless as ever, absorbed the renewed attention and moved on. For most people, the case was an old story resurfacing briefly before sinking again. For those inside it, the resurfacing felt different. Less like a ripple, more like a tide pulling back before a surge. Investigators prepared for resistance. Legal. Personal. Institutional. The man's silence had become a constant, a negative space shaping the inquiry. Silence can be coincidence. It can also be strategy. Distinguishing between the two required restraint, something the case demanded at every turn. As the fifth phase drew to a close, the file sat open on a desk once more, its contents reorganized, its questions sharpened. The story it told was no longer sprawling. It was focused, almost claustrophobic. A woman. A routine. A watcher. A city that provided cover without intent. Nothing had been proven. Nothing had been resolved. But the distance between mystery and meaning had narrowed, and in that narrowing space, the case exerted a pressure that was impossible to ignore. Somewhere within it, the truth was no longer drifting. It was holding its ground, waiting for the moment when patience would give way to consequence. By the sixth turn of the investigation, the case had stopped behaving like a ghost and started acting like a shadow. It didn't leap out. It followed. Every new piece of information seemed to fall just behind the detectives, close enough to feel its presence, far enough to deny capture. The work became quieter, more internal, driven less by discovery than by pressure building in places no one could quite name. The man's silence hardened into a fixture. It was no longer just a refusal, it was a strategy that shaped the investigation around it. Every path bent toward the same obstacle, every question ended at the same closed door. Detectives learned to work sideways, to look for what silence displaced rather than what it concealed directly. They examined his life not for crimes, but for absences, jobs he left without explanation, towns he exited abruptly, relationships that ended without conflict yet never resumed. One absence stood out. A gap in his employment history, brief but poorly explained, coinciding with the weeks immediately after the disappearance. At the time, it would have meant nothing. Now, it suggested movement under pressure. People drift for many reasons. They disappear for fewer. Investigators cross-referenced the gap with transit records, housing changes, anything that could anchor him to a location. The trail was faint, but it bent away from New York faster than expected, as if he had not lingered to see what would happen next. That haste raised a question no one had asked directly before, not why he left, but what he might have believed was coming. Did he expect attention? Did he sense scrutiny before it materialized? Or was the departure simply the next step in a life already accustomed to vanishing before roots could take hold? Motive is slippery in the absence of confession. The detectives resisted the urge to answer for him. The renewed focus began to surface old resistance within the department. Some argued the case was chasing a mirage, that decades of reinterpretation had inflated coincidence into conspiracy. Others countered that the absence of evidence was itself a product of timing, that the tools now available had simply arrived too late to catch what had once been visible. The debate was not loud, but it was constant, threading through meetings and reports like static. Then came the call no one expected. A former acquaintance of the man, someone who had lived briefly in the same building years after he left New York, reached out after seeing a mention of the case online. He didn't claim to know anything specific. He claimed to remember a conversation that had never sat right with him. It was about the city. About how easy it was to lose someone in it. About how people assumed noise meant safety. The detectives listened without interrupting. They'd learned the danger of leading witnesses, of shaping memory with expectation. The man on the phone spoke hesitantly, aware of how fragile recollection can be. He remembered the tone more than the words. It wasn't boastful. It wasn't remorseful. It was analytical, detached, as if the disappearance of a person were an architectural problem rather than a moral one. Was it incriminating? No. Was it disturbing? Yes. It aligned too neatly with the pattern they were building to be dismissed outright. The statement was documented, weighed, filed where it could neither dominate nor disappear. The case had taught them balance the hard way. Investigators began consulting behavioral specialists, not to build a profile for public consumption, but to test their own assumptions. The analysis that emerged was cautious but pointed. If the disappearance had been deliberate, it suggested familiarity, patience, and a comfort with proximity. Not a predator driven by impulse, but one guided by observation. Someone who blended, who learned the city by watching it, who understood that invisibility was an advantage earned over time. The profile did not name anyone. It didn't have to. It narrowed the field in a way evidence alone could not, creating a framework against which actions could be measured. Within that framework, the man fit too well to ignore, even as he remained legally untouched. Pressure mounted outside the department as well. Journalists began asking sharper questions, not about what had happened, but about why it had taken so long to reach this point. The story shifted subtly, from mystery to accountability. Cold case coverage has a way of turning inward, of examining the institutions meant to solve what they cannot. The detectives felt the weight of that scrutiny even as they welcomed it. Attention, after all, had been missing when it mattered most. The family was brought in again, this time not to receive updates, but to answer questions that had never been asked so directly. About her routines. About moments of unease she might have mentioned casually. About names that hadn't seemed important at the time. The process was painful, invasive, necessary. Each answer added texture, depth, reinforcing the sense that her life had been legible to someone who had no right to read it. One detail lingered. She had mentioned feeling watched once, in passing, brushed it off as city nerves. The timing aligned with the period investigators now believed the observation phase might have occurred. It wasn't proof. It was confirmation that fear, however faint, had existed before the night she vanished. That knowledge settled heavily in the room. As the sixth phase closed, the investigation reached an uncomfortable truth. It had likely gone as far as it could without a catalyst. Evidence alone would not move it forward. The case needed disruption. A mistake. A memory shaken loose. Or time itself, applying pressure in ways no detective could. The man continued to live his life, ordinary on the surface, untouched by accusation. The city continued to change, indifferent to the history buried beneath its streets. And the case, no longer frozen, no longer advancing, held its position, taut with anticipation. It had become clear that the mystery was no longer about what had happened in 1987. It was about what would happen next. About whether patience would outlast silence. About whether a truth carefully hidden for decades could remain concealed forever in a city built on the illusion that nothing stays buried. Somewhere between waiting and watching, the case tightened its grip, preparing for the moment when pressure would finally become too much, and the shadow would have nowhere left to go. The seventh phase began without permission, triggered not by investigators but by time itself, the slow erosion that turns secrecy into liability. Decades have a way of loosening structures that once felt permanent. People age. Loyalties thin. Certainties fracture. The case sensed it before anyone else did, shifting again, pressing outward, testing the seams that had held so long. The man was getting older. That fact alone changed the equation. Aging narrows options, introduces vulnerabilities where confidence once lived. Routines harden. Mistakes multiply. Investigators understood this not as opportunity, but as inevitability. They watched quietly, documenting what could be seen, careful not to provoke a reaction that might collapse what little remained accessible. It was a minor incident that drew attention first. A traffic stop in a different state. Nothing dramatic. No charges filed. Just a brief interaction logged into a system that now spoke more fluently than it once had. The report included an observation that would have meant nothing years earlier, agitation when questioned about prior residences. The note was subjective, almost disposable. In this case, it was preserved. That agitation echoed something familiar. The discomfort with timelines. The resistance to anchoring himself in specific places. Investigators added it to the growing mosaic, aware that patterns are often built from pieces too small to command attention on their own. The man remained free. He remained uncharged. But the shape around him continued to sharpen. Behind the scenes, legal teams began to engage in quiet hypotheticals. What would it take to compel cooperation? What threshold would justify renewed pressure? The answers were unsatisfying. Without direct evidence, leverage was limited. The law is designed to protect against suspicion masquerading as certainty. The detectives respected that, even as it frustrated them. They were not chasing a confession. They were waiting for a fracture. The fracture arrived indirectly. A woman, recently widowed, contacted the department after finding old letters among her late husband's belongings. They were unsent, fragmented, more like drafts than correspondence. They mentioned the city. They mentioned watching. They mentioned a night that went wrong. The husband's name was not the man's. But the handwriting referenced him, casually, as if assuming the reader already knew who he was. The detectives proceeded with caution. Grief distorts memory. Coincidence loves attention. Still, the letters warranted examination. The timeline placed their writing shortly after the disappearance. The tone was unsettled, anxious, unlike anything else found among the man's known associates. It suggested knowledge adjacent to action, the kind that comes from proximity without participation. When questioned, the widow struggled to provide clarity. She hadn't known about the letters. She hadn't recognized the name until she saw it connected to the case online. Her husband had never spoken of the woman who vanished. He had, however, mentioned the man once, described him as someone who knew how to disappear inside a crowd. At the time, it had sounded like admiration. The letters were not admissible proof. They were circumstantial, indirect, fragile. But they marked the first time the case had expanded beyond a single gravitational center. It suggested a network, however loose, however accidental. Secrets rarely survive alone. They move, attach themselves, leave impressions in unexpected places. Investigators revisited the man's social orbit, such as it was. Former roommates. Temporary co-workers. People who had brushed past him and kept moving. Most remembered nothing. A few remembered unease. One remembered a warning, delivered jokingly, about trusting strangers in cities that reward invisibility. None of it crossed the threshold of accusation. All of it reinforced the same impression. The pressure outside the department intensified. The case was no longer just unresolved, it was uncomfortable. Editorials questioned how many lives pass unexamined because they don't fit familiar patterns of threat. The story reframed itself again, this time as a meditation on how danger hides behind normalcy. The city, always eager to mythologize itself, leaned into the idea that the worst acts are often committed by those who leave no mark. Inside the investigation, fatigue set in. Not from the work, but from the restraint. Everything pointed in one direction, yet nothing allowed pursuit to become action. Detectives grappled with the ethics of persistence. At what point does focus become fixation? At what point does patience become complicity with silence? The questions had no clean answers. Then, quietly, the man broke routine. He moved again, earlier than expected, leaving behind another address without explanation. The timing was poor. It coincided with increased media attention. It suggested discomfort, not guilt, but discomfort was something they could measure. The move narrowed options, reduced unpredictability. Mobility had once been his advantage. Now it drew notice. Investigators documented the move, tracked the logistics, noted what was taken and what was left behind. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest urgency. They requested cooperation again, this time through intermediaries, framing it as an opportunity to clarify rather than confront. The response was immediate and unequivocal. No comment. No meeting. No clarification. Silence, once neutral, began to read differently. It accumulated context. It absorbed implication. The case leaned into it, using absence as material. Each refusal added weight to the question the investigation had been circling for years. How long can a life remain ordinary when its foundations rest on something unresolved? The seventh phase closed with no arrests, no charges, no declarations. But it closed with something else, inevitability. The sense that the case had passed a point of equilibrium, that the forces holding it in place were weakening. The truth had not emerged. It had shifted closer to the surface, close enough to distort what lay above it. The city continued its relentless forward motion, unaware that an old story was approaching a moment of reckoning. The man continued to live within the narrowing boundaries of his own choices. And the case, patient and unsparing, waited for the smallest misstep, the slightest crack, knowing that decades of silence can be undone not by confession, but by the simple failure to keep pretending that nothing ever happened. The eighth phase arrived not as a breakthrough, but as a tightening. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't come with headlines or handcuffs, but with a subtle change in air pressure that seasoned investigators learned to trust. The case was no longer expanding. It was compressing. Every loose thread had been pulled. What remained was dense, resistant, and close to something solid. It began with paperwork. Not the dramatic kind, not warrants or indictments, but the slow, grinding machinery of modern systems finally catching up with old movement. A national data integration update linked fragments that had once lived in isolation. Housing records spoke to utility logs. Employment stubs aligned with transit usage. None of it proved a crime. All of it traced a life that had been more deliberate than it appeared. The man's movements after leaving New York now formed a clearer line. Not random. Not opportunistic. Strategic. He chose places where anonymity was easy, where people arrived already trying to disappear. He stayed just long enough to be unremarkable, left just early enough to avoid familiarity. It was not the pattern of a drifter. It was the pattern of someone managing exposure. Investigators compared this to the disappearance again, overlaying the same logic. The night she vanished had not been chaotic. It had been efficient. No noise. No witnesses willing to swear certainty. No evidence left behind that demanded immediate attention. The absence itself had been the point. The city had done the rest. A decision was made to approach the man differently. Not as a suspect. Not even as a person of interest. As a witness to his own life. Detectives requested a voluntary interview framed around history, around clearing up inconsistencies that had emerged purely on paper. The tone was neutral. The timing deliberate. The request, legally speaking, was harmless. This time, something shifted. The response came slower than before. Days passed. Then weeks. When the reply finally arrived, it was cautious rather than dismissive. His attorney indicated openness to a limited conversation, strictly controlled, strictly informational. No accusations. No recordings beyond standard procedure. It was not cooperation. It was negotiation. And negotiation meant pressure had landed somewhere. The interview took place in a small, forgettable room, chosen on purpose. Nothing imposing. Nothing theatrical. The man arrived looking older than his years, thinner, careful in his movements. He spoke politely. He answered questions directly, but not expansively. His memory, once so neat, now faltered around edges that mattered. He remembered the bar. He remembered the neighborhood. He remembered her face when prompted with a photograph. He did not remember the night itself with clarity. Dates blurred. Sequences softened. He corrected himself more than once, a detail that might have meant nothing if not for how rarely he had done so in the past. The detectives listened. They didn't interrupt. They let silence do its work. When asked why he had left New York so quickly, his answer was practiced. Opportunity. Fatigue. The city wasn't for him anymore. When asked why he had moved so often afterward, the answer changed. Work. Preference. Restlessness. The explanations overlapped without aligning, like layers that never quite settled. At one point, without prompting, he mentioned how dangerous the city had been back then. How easy it was for people to get hurt without anyone noticing. The comment hung in the air longer than it should have. It wasn't wrong. It was revealing. He spoke as someone who had learned that lesson firsthand, not as someone who had read it in a paper. The interview ended without confrontation. No raised voices. No dramatic pauses. Just a quiet acknowledgement that further questions might follow. The man left composed, but altered. Something had been disturbed. The case felt it immediately. Back at the department, the recording was reviewed with care bordering on obsession. Not for what he said, but for how. Hesitations clustered around certain topics. Confidence spiked where it wasn't needed. His language shifted subtly when discussing movement, control, observation. Behavioral specialists noted it without exaggeration. Stress indicators. Cognitive load. Nothing definitive. Enough to matter. Then came the smallest fracture of all. A follow-up records check, routine and almost overlooked, revealed an error in one of his long-held claims. A minor one. A job he said he'd held during a specific period had not existed yet. The company hadn't opened until months later. It was the kind of discrepancy that could be innocent, the result of time eroding detail. It was also the first verifiable falsehood attached to his timeline. The correction was documented. Quietly. Carefully. It did not trigger action. It triggered focus. The man was contacted again, asked to clarify. This time, the response was defensive. He corrected himself, offered an alternative explanation, grew irritated at the implication that the detail mattered. His attorney intervened more aggressively than before. Boundaries were reinforced. The window narrowed again. But something had changed irrevocably. The case now had leverage, not legal, but psychological. The man knew his story was being examined at a level of precision he had never faced. The illusion of invisibility had cracked. Outside, the media sensed movement. Articles shifted from retrospective to anticipatory. Language changed. Developments. Renewed scrutiny. Questions intensify. The city, conditioned by decades of nothing, began to lean forward despite itself. The family was informed with caution. No promises. Just honesty. The case was active in a way it hadn't been before. They listened, silent, absorbing the weight of a possibility they had learned to fear almost as much as absence. Hope, when it returns after years of exile, does not arrive cleanly. It drags everything with it. As the 8th phase drew to a close, the investigation stood on a threshold. Not of resolution, but of exposure. The man's life, once carefully managed, now existed under a light that did not blink. The past, long silent, had begun to answer back, not with confession, but with inconsistency. And in cases like this, inconsistency is never just a flaw. It is a signal. A sign that the structure holding a secret together has begun to weaken, that pressure applied slowly and patiently has found its point of entry. The city waited, unaware of how close it was to hearing an old truth spoken aloud. The case waited too, coiled and deliberate, knowing that the next phase would not be about watching anymore, but about what happens when someone who has spent a lifetime controlling distance finally runs out of space. The years grind forward without mercy, and by the time the calendar flips again, the case is no longer spoken of in the present tense. It is archived, boxed, numbered. A cold case in every sense of the phrase, its heat drained away by time, its urgency replaced by routine, its name spoken only when a reporter needs a line or a detective needs an example of what never got finished. The city changes its face. Storefronts close. New signs go up. Streets that once echoed with sirens now hum with traffic and music, and the address tied to the crime becomes just another building people pass without knowing what happened inside. But beneath the layers of dust and paperwork, the case is not dead. It is waiting, dormant, like a pulse slowed to the point where you have to press your fingers hard just to feel it. In a storage room deep inside police headquarters, the evidence boxes sit shoulder to shoulder, their cardboard edges soft from age, their labels yellowed. Names written in marker have faded until they look like ghosts of words rather than words themselves. Inside one box, photographs curl slightly at the corners. Black and white images of a New York street in 1987. Police tape sagging between lampposts. A crowd frozen mid-stare. Inside another box, transcripts of interviews stretch on for pages, voices captured in ink, some confident, some trembling, some defensive, some carefully blank. These boxes have been opened before, many times, always with hope, always with the same result. Nothing new. No breakthrough. Just the familiar weight of failure settling back into place. Then, quietly, without a press conference or a headline, the case file is requested again. Not by someone who remembers the night firsthand, but by someone who has only known it as a number and a name. A cold case detective, younger than the crime itself, pulls the boxes from the shelf and carries them to a desk. There is no ceremony. No dramatic music. Just the sound of cardboard sliding against metal and the soft thud as the boxes are set down. This is how cold cases wake up. Not with sirens, but with paper. The detective starts at the beginning, not because the beginning holds all the answers, but because it holds all the assumptions. Every early theory is reread, every conclusion questioned. The narrative that hardened in the weeks after the crime is examined for cracks. Who was trusted too quickly? Who was dismissed too easily? Who said just enough to sound helpful and then vanished into the city? Patterns emerged that weren't visible before, not because they weren't there, but because no one had time to look for them. The city in 1987 was loud, chaotic, overwhelmed. Leads came in by the dozens. Tips flooded the lines. Detectives were forced to choose what mattered and what didn't, and those choices shaped everything that followed. One detail keeps resurfacing, a small inconsistency buried in the statements. A witness who placed someone at the scene, then later adjusted their timeline. A name that appears once in a margin, never followed up. A routine background check that was run but never expanded. It's not a smoking gun. It's not even a warm lead. It's a loose thread. And loose threads are dangerous, because once you pull them, you don't know what will unravel. The detective digs deeper, cross-referencing old names with modern databases. Records that once required days of phone calls now appear in seconds. Addresses update themselves. Aliases surface. A person of interest from 1987, once impossible to track, now leaves a digital trail stretching across decades. Employment records. minor arrests, a marriage, a divorce, a move out of state. The life of someone who kept breathing, kept aging, kept existing, while a family waited for answers that never came. The realization hits hard. Whoever did this didn't disappear. They blended in. As the timeline rebuilds itself, the crime no longer feels isolated. It sits at the intersection of patterns that were invisible at the time. The detective notices similarities with other unsolved cases from the same era. Not identical, not obvious, but close enough to raise a question. Same neighborhoods. Same late hours. Same type of victim. The city was flooded with violence in the late 80s, cases stacking up faster than they could be solved. It was easy for one story to get lost among dozens. Easy for a predator to move through the noise unnoticed. Interviews are revisited, not in person at first, but on paper. Voices from the past speak again. Some of the people are gone now, their words all that remain. Others are still alive, older, settled, convinced the worst moments of their lives are long behind them. When the detective begins making calls, reactions vary. Surprise. Confusion. Unease. A few hang up immediately. Others talk too much, filling the silence with unnecessary detail. Time has a way of loosening tongues, but it also sharpens instincts. People know when the past is catching up to them. One name, the same name that kept appearing in the margins, now stands out with clarity. In 1987, this person was questioned briefly, cleared just as quickly. No criminal record at the time. No obvious motive. Just another face in a city full of faces. But decades later, the picture looks different. A series of low-level offenses. Complaints that never became charges. A pattern of proximity that only makes sense in hindsight. The detective feels the shift, that subtle moment when a cold case stops being theoretical and starts being personal. Surveillance photos from the 80s are grainy, almost abstract, but when placed beside modern images, similarities jump out. The shape of a jaw. The set of the eyes. The way the shoulders slope. It's not proof. It's not enough. But it's more than anyone had before. The detective brings the findings to a supervisor, then to a prosecutor. Meetings happen behind closed doors. Old evidence is re-examined with new technology. Materials once considered useless are tested again, not with hope, but with precision. As the investigation gains momentum, the city remains largely unaware. There are no headlines yet. No alerts. Just quiet movement inside offices and labs. For the family of the victim, the silence is familiar. They've lived in it for decades. Anniversaries have come and gone. Birthdays passed with empty chairs. The idea that something might finally change feels dangerous, like tempting fate. They've been disappointed before. Promises were made. Leads were chased. Then everything went still again. The detective knows this history. Knows the weight of expectation. Every step forward carries the risk of reopening wounds without delivering answers. But the evidence keeps lining up, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like pieces of a puzzle that have been waiting for the right hands. A timeline that once felt chaotic now makes sense. A suspect who once seemed ordinary now appears central. The question is no longer whether someone did this, but how they managed to live so long without being caught. The realization is unsettling. If the theory is right, the person responsible walked free for decades, navigating the same city, breathing the same air, watching the world change while the crime remained frozen in time. They may have stood in crowds during news coverage of the case. They may have read headlines calling it a mystery, a tragedy, a cold case with no answers. They may have felt nothing at all. Or they may have felt everything, every day, hidden behind the routine of a normal life. As part 9 of this story unfolds, the case stands at a crossroads. No arrest yet. No public confirmation. Just a sense that the ground is shifting beneath a mystery that refused to stay buried. The cold case is no longer cold. It is tense, fragile, alive again. And somewhere out there, a past long thought safe is beginning to feel dangerously close, as the city of New York, unknowingly, edges toward a reckoning that has been delayed for nearly half a century. The pressure builds quietly, not in the streets, not on television, but in rooms where decisions carry weight measured in decades. The evidence, once scattered and uncertain, now forms a shape that can't be ignored. The detective feels it in the way conversations change tone, in the way supervisors stop asking hypothetical questions and start asking procedural ones. Warrants are discussed. Legal thresholds are weighed carefully. Every move must be precise, because a mistake now could collapse everything. A cold case reborn is fragile. One misstep, one overreach, and it dies all over again. The suspect's life is mapped out year by year, move by move. Addresses line up like stepping stones across states. Jobs appear and disappear. Relationships begin and end. There is nothing outwardly monstrous in the record, nothing that screams violence, and that is what makes it unsettling. The person investigators are circling built a life in plain sight. Paid taxes. Attended family gatherings. A neighbor. A coworker. A face no one would remember twice. The contrast between the brutality of the crime and the ordinariness of the life that followed creates a tension that never fully resolves. Old evidence is brought back into the light. Items once sealed and shelved are handled again, this time with gloves guided by protocols that didn't exist in 1987. Technology has changed the rules. Traces too small to matter before now speak loudly. The lab reports come back not with certainty, but with probability, and probability is enough to move forward. The prosecutor reads the results in silence, then looks up slowly. The case is no longer a historical exercise. It is viable. It can go to court. The decision to approach the suspect is debated intensely. Do they bring him in quietly? Do they watch longer? Do they risk spooking someone who has avoided consequences for decades? Surveillance begins, discreet and patient. The suspect's routines are documented. Morning departures. Evening returns. Errands. Social interactions. There is no sign of panic, no hint that the walls are closing in. If guilt lives there, it is deeply buried, shielded by time and habit. Meanwhile, the family is contacted, carefully, cautiously. Not with promises, not with certainty, but with honesty. There has been progress. Significant progress. The words land with mixed force. Relief and fear collide. Hope stirs, but it is guarded, restrained by years of disappointment. They ask questions that have no easy answers. Is it really different this time? Is it finally happening? The detective doesn't oversell it. They know better. They've seen how fast momentum can vanish. As preparations intensify, the city remains unaware, but echoes of the past begin to surface. Retired officers are called back for consultation. Old notebooks are pulled from drawers. Memories long dormant are forced awake. Some recall the case vividly, others only vaguely, but each recollection adds texture, context, depth. The chaos of the late 80s is described again: overloaded precincts, political pressure, fear everywhere. It becomes clearer how the case slipped through cracks that were wide and numerous. The suspect is interviewed under the guise of routine follow-up. The room is plain. The questions start innocently, circling the past without touching it directly. The suspect appears calm, cooperative, almost bored. Answers come easily, rehearsed by a lifetime of normalcy. But as the timeline tightens, as details sharpen, something shifts. Small hesitations appear. Corrections follow statements too quickly, as if preempting a mistake. The detective notices everything. Silence becomes a tool. The air thickens. When the crime is finally mentioned directly, there is no outburst, no dramatic reaction. Just a pause that lasts half a second too long. Eyes flicker. A breath is taken. The suspect denies involvement, flatly, predictably. But denial is no longer enough. The detective lays out fragments, not the full picture, just enough to suggest that the past is no longer safely buried. The interview ends without an arrest, but the message is delivered. The clock has started. Behind the scenes, warrants are finalized. The legal language is precise, deliberate. Search locations are identified. The margin for error is slim. Everything hinges on corroboration. When the order comes through, the team moves quickly, efficiently, without spectacle. Doors are knocked on, not kicked in. Items are collected. Devices seized. The suspect watches, stunned, as pieces of a carefully constructed life are boxed and labeled. The realization dawns slowly. This isn't routine. This is real. Analysis follows, methodical and relentless. Digital records reveal patterns that align with the rebuilt timeline. Communications expose proximity, opportunity, moments that can no longer be explained away as coincidence. Each discovery adds weight. The prosecutor reviews the growing stack of evidence late into the night, aware that this case will not just be judged on facts, but on history. Jurors will hear about a crime older than some of them. They will be asked to bridge decades with trust. The arrest decision is made quietly, deliberately. No leaks. No early headlines. The suspect is taken into custody without resistance. Handcuffs close around wrists that have never known them for this crime. The moment is understated, almost anticlimactic, and yet it carries the force of a reckoning delayed far too long. For the detective, there is no celebration, only a deep, steady breath. This is not the end. It is a threshold. When the news finally breaks, it hits hard. A New York cold case from 1987. An arrest after decades. A suspect who lived free for years. Headlines explode. The story spreads fast, fueled by disbelief and anger. Commentators ask how this could happen. How someone could evade justice for so long. The city reacts with a mix of shock and grim recognition. This was the era. This was the system. This was the cost of chaos. For the family, the announcement is surreal. Faces appear on screens. Names are spoken aloud again. The case that defined their lives is no longer just a memory. It is present, active, raw. There is no joy, only a complicated relief tangled with grief. Justice, if it comes, will not restore what was lost. It will not rewind time. But it will end the waiting. As Part 10 closes, the story stands on the edge of resolution, but nothing is simple. The arrest answers one question and raises dozens more. The past has been dragged into the present, and it refuses to be neat. The city watches. The courtroom awaits. And the truth, long hidden beneath years of silence and routine, prepares to speak at last, carrying with it the weight of a life taken and decades stolen by a mystery that refused to stay buried. The courtroom is smaller than the memory of the crime, smaller than the years that led here, but it carries a gravity that bends everything toward it. Wood panels polished by time, rows of seats filled with strangers who know the case only through headlines, and at the center, the defendant, older now, hair grayed, posture careful, eyes forward. This is the same person who once blended into a city of millions, who walked free while a family marked time by absence. The years have changed the face, softened the edges, but they have not erased the past. They have only delayed it. The prosecution begins not with drama, but with restraint. They know this case must be built slowly, deliberately, brick by brick. Jurors are asked to travel back to New York in 1987, to imagine the noise, the fear, the overload. They hear about a night when everything went wrong, about a victim whose life ended violently and without explanation, about a community that reeled and then moved on because it had to. Evidence is introduced carefully, each piece tied to the next, not to overwhelm, but to clarify. Old photographs resurface, grainy and stark, capturing moments frozen in panic. The city looks different then, harsher, rawer, but the emotion in the images is timeless. Witnesses take the stand, some with voices steady, others shaking. A retired officer describes the chaos of the original investigation, the impossible workload, the decisions made under pressure. A forensic expert explains how technology changed the rules, how traces once invisible now speak with precision. The timeline is rebuilt in front of the jury, not as it was once imagined, but as it appears now, corrected by hindsight and data. The defense pushes back, emphasizing gaps, the passage of time, the dangers of memory stretched thin by decades. They remind the room that certainty is rare in old cases, that doubt grows naturally with age. The defendant listens, expression controlled, hands folded. When addressed directly, the answers are brief, careful. Innocence is asserted without flourish. A life lived openly is presented as proof that nothing was hidden. Friends and family testify to character, to normalcy, to the impossibility that someone so ordinary could be capable of something so brutal. The contrast is stark, unsettling. The courtroom feels the tension between what people want to believe and what the evidence suggests. This is where cold cases live or die, in the space between comfort and truth. Outside, the city watches. News vans line the streets. Commentators dissect every moment, every glance, every pause. The story becomes part of a larger conversation about justice delayed, about systems that failed and then corrected themselves too late. Social media fills with arguments, theories, outrage. Some celebrate the arrest as a triumph. Others question it relentlessly. The case is no longer just about one crime. It is about time itself, about whether truth can survive decades of silence. For the family, each day in court is exhausting. Faces from the past resurface. Details long buried are spoken aloud, amplified, dissected. There are moments of validation, when the narrative aligns with what they always felt but could never prove. There are also moments of pain, when the defense challenges the memory of the victim, when the humanity of the person lost is reduced to exhibits and timelines. Closure, they realize, is not a single moment. It is a process, uneven and heavy. As arguments conclude, the jury retreats to deliberate. The room empties slowly, tension lingering like a static charge. Days pass. Speculation grows. The weight of the decision presses down on 12 people asked to bridge nearly 40 years with reason and conscience. They review evidence again, debate credibility, wrestle with doubt. They are acutely aware that whatever they decide will echo far beyond this room, into a family's history, into the city's memory, into the idea of whether justice can truly be late and still be justice. When the verdict is finally read, the courtroom holds its breath. Words land with finality, cutting through years of uncertainty. The outcome is not cinematic. There is no explosion of emotion, no neat resolution that satisfies everyone. There is only the acknowledgement that the story has reached a point it could not reach before. Accountability, at last, has a shape. Consequences are spoken into existence. The law does what it can, no more, no less. Sentencing follows, measured and solemn. The judge speaks of the harm done, of a life taken, of the long shadow cast by violence unresolved. They acknowledge the decades that passed, the pain compounded by waiting. The sentence is delivered not as vengeance, but as recognition. Recognition that time does not erase responsibility. Recognition that living freely does not undo what was done. The defendant is led away, no longer anonymous, no longer untouched by the past. When the courtroom empties for the last time, the city exhales. Headlines shift from speculation to aftermath. Commentators move on. The news cycle searches for the next shock. But for those closest to the case, the end does not arrive with a single door closing. It arrives gradually, in quieter ways. In the ability to speak the victim's name without the word unsolved attached. In the knowledge that the story, though tragic, is no longer incomplete. The detective returns to the office, boxes still stacked, files still open. There is paperwork to finish, reports to close. The case will soon be labeled, resolved, its status changed in a database that did not exist when the crime occurred. It is a small action, a few keystrokes, but it carries weight. Another cold case brought back to life, then laid to rest properly. There is satisfaction, but it is tempered. One success does not erase the countless mysteries still waiting in the dark. The family steps into a future that feels unfamiliar. For decades, the case defined their days, their conversations, their sense of time. Now there is space where the question used to be. Space is both relief and burden. Healing does not follow a schedule. It moves unevenly, shaped by memory and loss. But there is something new now, something solid where uncertainty once lived. The truth, imperfect and late, but real. Years from now, the case will be referenced in articles and lectures, cited as an example of what persistence and technology can achieve. It will be called a cold case solved, a mystery finally answered. But those words will never fully capture what it meant to live inside the question for so long, to wake each day without knowing, to age alongside an unresolved death. They will not capture the cost of waiting, or the strange, hollow quiet that follows resolution. And yet, as the city continues to change, as new stories rise and fall, this one settles into its place in history. A crime committed in 1987. A life lost. A killer who lived free for decades. An arrest that came late, but not too late to matter. The echo of it lingers, a reminder that time can hide the truth, but it cannot bury it forever. In New York, amid the noise and motion, a long silent story has finally spoken, leaving behind not peace, exactly, but something closer to balance, a hard-won stillness after years of unanswered questions. Time does not stop when a verdict is read. It simply shifts its weight. The case, now officially closed, begins a second life in the public imagination, stripped of nuance and compressed into headlines and summaries. Solved after decades. Killer caught. Justice at last. The words move fast, too fast to carry the years of silence that came before them. They move faster than grief, faster than memory, faster than the quiet nights when the answer did not exist. But beneath the noise, something irreversible has happened. A question that haunted a city has been answered, and the echo of that answer travels outward in ways no one fully anticipates. In the weeks that follow, the family retreats from the cameras. Statements have been made. Gratitude expressed. Boundaries drawn. They return to ordinary spaces that never felt ordinary before, rooms shaped by absence, routines built around waiting. Now the waiting is over, but the habits remain. They discover that resolution does not erase the past, it rearranges it. Photographs once too painful to look at are taken out again. Stories are told with fewer interruptions. The victim becomes more than a case file, more than a crime scene, more than a date on a calendar. They become fully human again, remembered not just for how their life ended, but for how it was lived. The detective feels the aftermath differently. There is pride, yes, but also an unexpected emptiness. For years, the case provided direction, a constant pull. Late nights, early mornings, endless review. Now the file is closed, the evidence returned to storage, the urgency gone. Another box on a shelf, this one marked resolved. The detective understands something now that veterans always hinted at: closure belongs more to the living than to those who chased it. Solving a cold case does not bring relief so much as it brings perspective. It sharpens awareness of how many questions remain unanswered, how many boxes are still waiting. Inside the department, the case becomes a reference point. Training sessions mention it. Younger investigators ask questions. How was it reopened? What changed? The answer is never simple. Persistence. Technology. A willingness to doubt old conclusions. A refusal to let time be an excuse. But there is also luck, and everyone knows it. The right detail noticed by the right person at the right moment. The city is full of cases that never get that alignment. This one did. That knowledge is both inspiring and unsettling. The convicted individual fades from public view quickly. Courtroom sketches give way to silence. The ordinary life that once masked the past is replaced by a routine defined by consequence. There are no more interviews, no more explanations. The story no longer belongs to them. History has taken it back. What remains is a stark lesson that time spent free does not equal time forgiven, that years can pass without justice but not beyond it. New York absorbs the story the way it absorbs everything, with a brief surge of attention followed by gradual forgetting. The streets where the crime occurred continue to carry traffic and noise. New residents move in, unaware of what happened there decades earlier. The city does not pause to remember, but it does not fully forget either. The case joins the long, layered memory of a place that has seen too much to hold on to every detail, yet somehow carries them all. Occasionally, the case resurfaces in conversation, usually framed as proof that answers can still come, that patience is not always wasted. It offers comfort to some, frustration to others. For families still waiting, it is both hope and reminder. Hope that the truth can survive time. Reminder that waiting can last a lifetime. The solved case becomes a mirror held up to the unsolved ones, reflecting both possibility and cruelty. Years later, when the headlines are gone and the footage archived, the real legacy settles in quietly. It lives in policy changes, in renewed attention to forgotten files, in the understanding that closure is not a moment but a process. It lives in the way a single decision to reopen a box altered the trajectory of countless lives. It lives in the recognition that justice delayed reshapes everyone it touches, not just the victim and the accused, but the city itself. The story, when told again, will sound clean. A crime. A mystery. An arrest. A resolution. But those who lived inside it know the truth is heavier, messier, slower. They know about the years when nothing happened, when hope felt foolish, when the case was spoken of in the past tense even though it had no ending. They know that solving it did not undo those years. It only gave them meaning. And so the case finally rests, not as a perfect conclusion, but as a hard-earned answer. A reminder etched into the city's long history of noise and shadows. A testament to the idea that even after decades, even after silence, even after the world has moved on, the truth can still surface, demanding to be seen, demanding to be acknowledged. In New York, where stories pile up faster than they can be told, one long-buried voice was finally heard, and its echo, though quieter now, continues to resonate, steady and unresolved in its own way, long after the cold case stopped being cold. Long after the last article is archived and the final broadcast fades into background noise, the case continues to breathe in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. It surfaces in quiet conversations between detectives late at night, when someone mentions an old file and another replies, almost reflexively, that nothing is ever truly finished. It appears in classrooms and seminars, where instructors speak of persistence and patience, of how truth can remain buried not because it is gone, but because no one is ready to face it yet. The story becomes less about a single crime and more about the endurance of unanswered questions, about the way time tests both memory and resolve. The family settles into a rhythm that feels unfamiliar, as if the ground beneath them has shifted slightly but permanently. For years, every day carried the same unfinished sentence, a constant mental pause waiting for an ending. Now that ending exists, fixed and unchangeable. They find themselves returning to ordinary moments, shared meals, small celebrations, quiet evenings, and realizing that the case no longer dominates every thought. Grief remains, but it is no longer entangled with uncertainty. There is a difference between mourning and wondering, and for the first time in decades, they are free to mourn without asking why. The detective, too, carries the case forward in ways that aren't written down. When faced with new investigations, especially the ones that feel impossible, there is a memory of this file, this long road, this improbable resolution. It becomes a silent benchmark, a reminder that patience can coexist with urgency, that skepticism can be productive, that reopening the past is sometimes the only way to move forward. The detective knows not every case will end like this one. Most won't. But knowing that some can is enough to keep going. Inside the department archives, the box marked with the case number sits among others that look identical. The difference is internal, invisible to anyone who doesn't know where to look. The word resolved is printed clearly, decisively. It does not glow. It does not celebrate. It simply exists. A quiet acknowledgement that a question once asked relentlessly has finally been answered. Nearby, countless other boxes wait, each holding its own silence, its own unfinished story. The city moves on, because cities always do. New crises demand attention. New tragedies rewrite the headlines. The streets where the crime occurred are repaved, renamed, repurposed. People walk them without awareness, carrying their own concerns, their own destinations. Yet beneath the layers of movement and noise, the past remains part of the foundation. New York is built on accumulated stories, solved and unsolved alike, each one contributing to the texture of a place that never truly forgets, even when it appears to. Occasionally, someone stumbles across the case years later, through a documentary, an article, a late-night search fueled by curiosity. They read about a crime from 1987, about decades of silence, about an arrest that came almost impossibly late. To them, it is history, a contained narrative with a beginning and an end. They feel a brief shock, a moment of intrigue, then move on. They cannot feel the weight of the waiting, the way time stretched and folded around a single unanswered question. That weight belongs only to those who lived inside it. The story's power lies not in its resolution, but in its duration. In the reminder that justice is not a single act, but a long, uneven pursuit. That failure and success can exist in the same timeline, separated only by persistence and chance. That the truth does not always announce itself loudly, but often arrives quietly, after years of being ignored, carrying with it the accumulated gravity of everything it outlasted. As the decades continue to turn, the case becomes part of a larger narrative about accountability and memory. It is cited not as a miracle, but as a warning and a promise. A warning about what happens when systems are overwhelmed, when details are missed, when urgency fades too quickly. A promise that even then, even after time has done its damage, the door to the truth may still be unlocked. In the end, the case does not offer comfort so much as clarity. A life was taken. A city was shaken. A mystery lingered for decades. And finally, an answer emerged, incomplete but real. The silence that followed is different from the silence that came before. It is not empty. It is filled with acknowledgement, with the knowledge that the question was heard, even if it was answered too late to change the past. The story settles into the long memory of New York, one more chapter among thousands, distinguished not by spectacle, but by endurance. A cold case that refused to stay buried. A truth that waited patiently for the world to catch up. And in that waiting, a quiet lesson remains, echoing beneath the city's endless motion. Time can delay justice, distort it, test it, but it cannot erase it, and sooner or later, even the oldest silence has a way of breaking.